Well, welcome everyone to the relaunch of the Street Talks of the Claiming the Streets platform. We are very happy with this relaunch. We're also sort of launching the website, so trying to post more and make our visibility a bit better, as well as try to connect to other people. So it's also an open invitation to anyone who wants to join or knows people who should perhaps join or would be interested to join, to let us know. And to share any news that you might have on streets and street research. Today we'll have our first talk of the Street Talks after almost, I think the Street Talks itself were only, we're back in the COVID period, but at least since our conference in 2022, so it's over a year. We'll do these Street Talks every 2 months is the idea, and the next session will be on the 7th of February at the same time on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Amsterdam time, and Katherine VanHoose will give the next talk. So that's sort of the information I wanted to share before we start with today's talk. And today we have Katherine VanHoose, which I'm really delighted to see both her and her research here today, because when we started this initiative, the project that she's part of, the Extra project, was just starting off. And now she just told me she's really sort of nearing the end of her project and completing it. So it's really exciting to hear from you. As Katherine already knows, but maybe some newcomers to the Street Talks don't, this is a very informal affair. So Katherine will talk. Obviously, there's space for questions at the end, preferably. But if you have a question in the meantime, please raise your digital hand and ask her question. Yeah, so the floor is yours, Katherine.
Great, thank you. And if you, I'm revisiting Zoom, so where is this digital hand going to pop up if someone has a question?
In the
I don't mind being interrupted to answer any questions. So thank you. Yeah, it's really nice to be back here, and like you said, finishing up my project, so actually having something to tell instead of mostly just questions, which is how it is at the beginning of a PhD project. Yeah, maybe just a little bit about myself first. You can see here my research is part of the Extra project, which Daniela just mentioned, and the Extra project is a European research project which stands for Experimenting with City Streets to Transform Urban Mobility. And we, Luca, who's also here today, who's actually my supervisor, we're involved in this project. We represent the University of Amsterdam, and we are in the project together with other academic partners in 6 different cities across Europe, and also some local partners. So it's really bringing in local governments, municipalities, but also some kind of like think tanks and also consultants. So really bringing in all 3 of these different types of partners, which is really great for, learning and being involved actually in practice and being able to connect your research to practice. So just a little bit of background, because I'm also not really sure who I'm talking to, and I have this version of this presentation for students, and I have this version of this presentation for people that know everything about urban mobility. So just in a nutshell, basically, why are we even talking about experimenting? Why are we even talking about changing urban mobility? Well, I think these 3 pictures kind of show the situation that we are currently in. So obviously car traffic has become, quite overwhelming, and it's the #1 producer, at least in cities, of CO2 emissions. But not just CO2 emissions from gas, but also just parking cars, which you can see in the picture on the right. So cars obviously take up also a lot of space, and something that I think people forget is that this also adds to climate change in a different way. So where you don't have space maybe for trees or for greenery because you put a car there, this also has quite a big influence on temperatures, as you can see here. And also in the bottom left corner, just how busy cities are getting and how much public space is increasingly becoming under pressure. And also asking the question of, okay, how to divide the space, which is increasingly at a minimum. So this is a diagram from Gale Architects, and it's basically kind of putting this whole...
I think, Catherine, we're not
yeah.
seeing the same visuals as you were. So
Oh,
I think we're at the
Yeah,
slide.
yeah,
You have two tabs open.
yeah. We are on slide 1 still. Yes, now it's
Oh yeah,
moving.
exactly.
oh,
Yeah.
so it's not going as I click it.
No.
Oh, should I just show it like this then?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
It's a little bit messier, but
No
okay.
problem.
Okay. So this is an image from Gale Architects, and it's basically kind of showing this need to reprioritize the hierarchy that our streets are currently designed for, and basically, well, putting people, and that includes pedestrians, but also cyclists, back on top, putting public transport in the second position, and still having cars, but yeah, making them less prominent in city streets. So I put a question mark that wasn't actually originally there, but I put a question mark because the question is how to do this, and this is quite a challenge. So I always like to do this with people. And we're gonna do a little exercise, so turn your microphones on. Whenever you see the word the streetscape, what comes to mind? And when I say the streetscape, I mean the road and also the sidewalks. What kind of activities can you do in this place? Just shout it out.
Walking.
Walking. Trees? So like a place for trees?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
What else?
Okay, I'll be radical and say shopping.
Yeah. Shopping. Yeah. You can shop in the street, definitely. What else?
Running.
Running, yeah. So we could just say exercising, maybe.
They're all healthy, aren't they? Pubs.
Yeah. So drinking or eating.
Yeah.
Hanging around.
Yeah, socializing.
Socializing, yeah.
Socializing, yeah. Yeah. Okay. What else?
Playing.
Playing, yeah.
Yeah, but I also instantly think of loads of cars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So street is also for driving and for moving.
Yeah, or mostly stationary cars.
Yeah. So we could say storage.
Yeah, storage. Yeah.
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 Yeah, not just cars, but also storing bicycles, storing trash containers,
Yeah.
these kind of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, clutter.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, different sorts of people. I mean, not all the same. Women, men, old, young, one color, the other color, rich, poor, and maybe in one street more one type, in the other another type. But variety of people. People is not one thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But ultimately a place for people.
Yeah, but people that might like or not like each other, might want the same or not. So diversity, yeah.
Yeah. Should we see if we got them all? And this is not an absolute list, it will also change, but and it changes every time I do this because people come up with things. Like last time, oh, it's not here. Oh, well, look, this is one benefit of doing a presentation. Last time someone said sleeping.
Dancing in the street. That's a good one.
Yeah, dancing, eating, sleeping, selling, so commerce, and obviously the kind of standard use of just moving. So that could be walking or cars. But the reason why I like to do this is because the idea that you can use a street for something other than just getting from point A to point B is not the standard way of thinking. And that's kind of where our research takes a different look on this relationship in general, but also different uses that a street could be used for. And this again is all in this context of transitioning for the purpose of kind of, alleviating these climate challenges that we are currently struggling with.
Can I ask, is there a particular reason why you used all verbs, as it were, and not? I mean, Luca mentioned trees, and I also thought of objects, and someone said those trash containers, or maybe you said it yourself. So I was wondering whether you had sort of whether there was.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's really no, I did not put thought into that, but I did it just automatically. I think I really see the street, I guess, as a place where you can, that you use and you're active and you do something.
Yeah.
They're
all actions, I suppose, aren't they?
Yeah. And the thing that we're going to talk about today are very actionable initiatives. So those are city street experiments. And the definition that we have for street experiments is an intentional and temporary change to the street use, regulation, and form. And the reason why this is different from, say, some examples of do-it-yourself urbanism is really that intentional part. So it's really meant to explore system change and really shifting from using the street as a place for cars towards a street as a place for people and these other uses. Now I need to zoom out a little. So we've got some examples here, and these are some typologies that we have. Well, we kind of, Luca made the first step in kind of giving these different examples that were already out there and trying to categorize them into typologies. So you might recognize a few, and maybe you didn't even know that it was a street experiment. But over here, for instance, we have remarking streets. So that's really painting intersections. This comes back in a lot of different examples of street experiments. And this one in particular is from Portland, Oregon, and that's called intersection repairs. And basically the idea is that cars are kind of forced to slow down and be more aware of crossing intersections, mostly in residential neighborhoods, so that they can say, okay, I need to slow down here because this is quite strange if there's something painted on the middle of the street. We also have repurposing parking. So this example is a parklet, I think quite well known. The first ones were in San Francisco, and basically it's the idea that you pay for you pay the meter to have this space as a place to sit and relax and just be, and not as a place to put your car for a short amount of time. We also have flexible closures, and the most recent example of this is a school street. So it's closing a street to cars and opening it up to other uses during certain times of the day. So during drop-off and pickup times, for instance, in front of schools. This one's really popular in the UK and in London in particular. And then we have, these are kind of going in order of complexity. And then we have up here partial repurposing. And the most famous example of this, I think, would be Times Square, which used to be just one big road with lots of traffic, but obviously also a lot of people that need to use this space and pedestrians. Which was also actually an experiment before it was permanently made into what it is now. And the last one, this is actually a picture from the living streets in Ghent. And this is an entire repurposing example where you close down a road for the entire road. So no traffic is allowed to go through. And the space that's left over, you use it for other uses. So here you can see they put a playground, they have benches. Yeah, and that's usually for 2 months, a living street. And if you want to, if you have Instagram, then you can look at some other examples on this account, which is just street experiments. And they have really tons of examples from all over the world, which is really nice, like encyclopedia. But as you can see here and all these examples, it's really nice to give a presentation about this because you get really beautiful pictures with all of these colorful murals on the ground, and you have these pictures of people coming together to kind of implement these things. But the bigger question, which we've been looking at in our project, is how do these street experiments actually change this status quo of streets for cars? And how do they actually reach system change in urban mobility? So are they just some temporary fun initiatives, or can they actually reach larger system change? So this is my research question that I've been kind of chasing after for the last 4 years. So how do these street experiments and the urban mobility system interact in order to accelerate this transition towards greater sustainability and urban mobility? And the reason why that's important, at least the urban mobility system part, is because street experiments can't just do it on their own, but it's really the system allowing for street experiments to do what street experiments do best. But before we go into more details, I think it's also important to talk about system change and what that actually means. And here we're getting kind of theoretical, but basically the way that I define system change is this co-evolutionary development of institutional, behavioral, and material arrangements. So street experiments aim to change institutional aspects, so policy, rules, regulations, behaviors, so how users actually use a street, and also the actual physical infrastructure. But you can obviously, look at this relationship between street experiments and system change from many different angles. But if we really look at the literature and the theory that's already out there, mostly from transition studies, then these are kind of the 4 key elements to the puzzle that I decided to focus on in my research. And basically, each one of these is one of the 4 papers that I had to write for my PhD. So each one kind of zooms in on one of these 4 aspects. So the first one, for instance, is really about the role of the experiment. So the design, but how is the experiment organized, for instance, how does that relate to this bigger relationship? But also the role that formal institutions play. So the role that, say, a municipality adapts towards street experiments, how does that affect this relationship? But also, as I said, the role of the system. So is the system ready? Is it ready to allow experiments to actually change things? That's also a big part of this equation. And the last one, which, at least for transition studies, transition scholars say that learning is really the key mechanism by which experiments contribute to transitions. And that's why I decided to focus on the role of learning and how that plays a part in this relationship or not. And in order to do this, like I said, these are 4 papers. So this one, and this one are out there and can be read. Also published open access. This one is still under review, but it's the last one that's being worked on. And basically, in order to do this, and that was one great part about being in this bigger project, also with people in practice who are actually doing street experiments, because we had a wealth of examples and case studies that I could use empirically to actually explore these questions in more detail. So, for instance, this role of the experiment, I got to compare 6 different experiments, 3 in Amsterdam, 3 in Munich, and really zoom in on, okay, how are they designed? How did the process go? And did they actually lead to system change? But also, for instance, looking at the living streets, so that picture I showed earlier with the slide, and following those over basically their 10-year existence and seeing how the role of the municipality affected the experiment and its ability to change things. And the role of the system was a literature review, so looking at empirical studies of experiments that were already out there and highlighting enablers and barriers according to those studies. And the last one was a case study zooming in on how learning happened during the implementation of low traffic neighborhoods in London during the pandemic. So the most important findings, basically what I thought in the beginning is that whether or not street experiments can cause system changes, both dependent on its own design, but also how the system in which it occurs reacts to the experiment. And basically, even for, you could say, well, we don't like to use words like perfect, but even for the perfect experiment, they still run into really serious institutional barriers. So you should think about regulations, permits, but already like cultural ideas about what a street should be used for. All of these things are barriers that street experiments run into. And the funny thing is that it even happens for those that are actually organized or initiated by local governments. So that's also quite curious. And I should have mentioned at the beginning that all the examples that we focus on are ones that are either started by local governments, or they at least involve the local government in some kind of role. So that also kind of highlights that maybe one part of municipality is interested in experimenting or even tries to experiment, but they even get blocked by someone from another department within the same organization, which is quite curious actually. Properly communicating plans and ambitions to stakeholders is extremely important, especially for more radical projects. But I should actually just say for street experiments in general, because street experiments by definition are quite radical, and doing something like this, it's really important to make sure that those are going to be affected know what to expect. And this is also something in the beginning, at least they look kind of thrown together, and they often use like found materials, or they have kind of informal barriers or cones and this kind of thing. But actually, street experiments require quite a great deal of financial resources, material resources, but also human resources. So basically everyone that I've talked to that's involved in an initiative like this, at least at local governments, for instance, many of them end up having burnouts, because it's really requires a lot of time and energy, probably because they're doing something new. But it shouldn't be thought that, oh, an experiment, it's quick and easy, but it's actually quite intensive. And this one also kind of goes along, maybe that's why they require leadership, and it should also be clear what the intent is. But basically, if the local government is in a leading role, that can support experiments, especially ones that are just starting out and when they are more radical. And then some findings about the question of learning. So, like I said, I focused on learning that happened during the low traffic neighborhoods in London, specifically in Islington and Hackney. Is anybody from London? No? Okay, or familiar with? No. Basically what we found, and this was already quite known in general, that learning is really fueled by the social interactions that happened during these types of experiments. But they also learn by way of other means. So just by experiencing an experiment firsthand, but also evaluating and assessing it, and also interestingly, vandalism. You also, if you go outside and you see someone's cut the wires on the cameras, or someone has put graffiti on the sign that says this road is closed to cars, for instance, that also tells you something about what other stakeholders think about the experiment. And because street experiments kind of automatically include actors, because they aim to transform streets, which is really, something that affects maybe the daily mobility pattern of a person, then that could also explain why they usually result in quite a bit of resistance, because people don't like the fact that their situation is changing, and it also feels like it's happening to them instead of it happening with them. So they don't really feel like they have a choice. And additionally, if they don't include all actors, street experiments, then that can lead to increased conflict. But, well, whenever I hear the word conflict, I think of something quite negative. But conflict is not necessarily something negative, because at least in the low traffic neighborhoods, it led to increased social interaction and also led to more learning, which then is in turn a positive thing. So this is my last slide, and then we can talk about everything. Just some food for thought. Yeah, it's still kind of a big question of how to kind of reconcile this way of experimenting with streets. So really testing what works and what doesn't work before deciding what to translate into long-term policy. And how you can kind of reconcile that with, well, on the one hand, the ways that we are already doing things, and kind of make room for this type of urban planning to really succeed and show its added value. And also another question that I thought of recently while writing the conclusions for my manuscript is really this question of like when to end experiments, because what I've noticed is if you look at a lot of these examples, they're successful, and usually they get repeated, but they get repeated in an experiment form, so not making it permanent, but keeping it as an experiment. And then it seems over time they kind of lose their added value because they keep being implemented as experiments, but maybe they have become outdated, or they're not really matching the needs of a neighborhood anymore, or a street, and they're just becoming less radical because they've been there for many years in a row, for instance. So that's also an interesting question that's related to this topic. And yeah, that's the last slide. So now all of your burning questions.
Thank you, Katherine. I thought it was splendid, also very well timed, and there's a lot of stuff in there. So I don't know if someone else has a question who wants to go first, but otherwise, I was really interested in your comparison, and I mean, these questions that you have on the screen now are also super interesting, so I want to hear more about that too. But if I think about comparative studies, which we also do in history, and which we've been doing with the project a lot, you also have to work with, well, you already pointed out institutional factors that are different maybe, but also I was thinking about culture. And you mentioned that a little bit already, but I was wondering if you could say more to what extent your cities throw up very different results in these types of experiments because they have a different attitude towards maybe car use, or towards indeed what you said, what is a street and how should we shape that street. And I'm just really curious to see whether there is more overlap between the cities and maybe more diversity between different groups within the cities or areas, or what has the comparative angle thrown up?
Well, I think especially in the last paper, when I looked at all these different examples of the empirical studies, there were some in Latin America, some in North America, some in Europe, actually only those three. But what you notice is that it doesn't really matter where they are all running into the same problems, which I think is really interesting, because obviously how local governments work in Latin America is very different to how it works in US, you know. So that's I think that's quite interesting, and also good to know in a way, because everyone is kind of trying to discover how to do this, what's the best way to do it, and maybe some have found that, but it's not like one successful example like the ciclovías in South America, which is an example of flexible closure. So on Sundays they're closed to traffic, but yeah, it's not like that only works there, which is actually really good news for other places who might want to try that. And obviously, you know, it won't work in every place, and it's always context specific. But I think the general message is that the main barrier, like those institutional barriers, can be overcome. There are examples of doing it if you are aware of kind of the right strings to pull. So that's one positive aspect of comparing different cities and different places.
Yeah. Claire also sent a comment. I don't know if you saw that, about the different class and backgrounds, economic backgrounds. So she writes different economic backgrounds and class often comes into it in the UK.
Yeah. That actually kind of accidentally popped up while I was studying the low traffic neighborhoods. Originally, I was also looking at Tower Hamlets, neighboring borough, and really very different in terms of how they, at least the local government, views these types of initiatives. And yeah, also plays into this question of resistance, because resistance comes from somewhere. People aren't just angry or upset about these things because they are just angry and upset about them. But actually that was really an interesting kind of cultural difference, because in Tower Hamlets, there's a really big Bangladesh population.
Yeah.
And they, for people from Bangladesh, at least this is what the people that I interviewed, they told me that they see the car as really a cultural symbol. So having a car is really saying a lot about your cultural status, and taking that away and maybe suggesting that they sell their car and get a bicycle instead, that really means that would really be a negative thing for that culture. So that's why that also plays into this whole question of, okay, why is it so heated and why are people so resistant? It definitely ties into cultural ideas and norms and feelings about mobility, actually.
Yeah.
Is it all only culture, or maybe also, for instance, some people be more dependent on a car for really essential things, for reaching jobs or care than others. Is that also?
That's also part of it. So in London, a lot of taxi drivers, obviously, who's basically that's their way. That's their way that they earn money. And by doing something like this, you're taking that away, at least in some sense. But it seems like whenever they plan these things, that at least the people that I've talked to that actually organize these experiments, that they're very aware of people with disabilities, for instance, still being able to go into a low traffic neighborhood, or people whose work really depends on those types of transportation, that's also considered. But one person said that they wanted to make it difficult for people that take their car to drive like 2 minutes to the shop on the corner, because that's actually the point. Is she said, we want to do this experiment in order to see if those people will then change their behavior. So they're not really targeting the people that really need it, but it's really the ones that maybe haven't thought, okay, that might not be necessary.
Yeah, we've got a lot of different things going on here in Newcastle, which is where I live, as opposed to where I'm working, where I was representing when I came over from to Amsterdam when I was talking about York. So I live in Newcastle, and we've got a lot of different schemes on at the minute, which vary from making nice spaces in the city centre to sit and eat, have a break from shopping, play. You know, there's big spaces down on the quayside that are given over to different play areas and sun lounges and that kind of thing. And I think they're generally perceived quite well because they're in the city centre. They're not stopping anybody driving anywhere. So apart from grumbles perhaps about houses being funded, you know, that's generally perceived as quite nice, because let's face it, as with most UK city centres, it's looking a bit tatty, shall we say, a bit downtrodden. But then outside of the city centre, so we've got experiments going on like that, which have been going on a while. Some are being made permanent, but they're generally there during the summer. Then in the suburbs, like where I live, we've got these low traffic neighbourhoods, and they're a bit of a nightmare, to be honest. They're temporary, but it's what you were saying, they're sort of long-term temporary. So to me, they just look like clutter, because they're just big concrete blocks saying, don't drive down this street anymore, that have now been graffitied across. And what we really need is, you know, just some what they're called, ANRP cameras, the number plate recognition cameras, to be put up and for people to know. But I suppose it takes time, doesn't it, for people to get into the habit of avoiding the rat runs that they're trying to cut out. So they're a bit contentious. We've got these school temporary closures. There's a school behind me where you're not allowed to drive down it at certain times, and you just forget. That's a bit of a nightmare. And then the main problem, I'm saying problem, I mean, don't get us wrong, I'm all for, you know, helping the climate and trying to get out of cars and things, but they've now introduced a congestion charge like they have in London and many other cities in the UK. So that affects me because one of my cars falls foul of this. So I've changed my habits using that particular vehicle, but it doesn't mean I drive it any more or less. It just means I have to go a different way and pay lots of money to use other toll roads and things. So that's generally seen as a money-making scheme by most people. I'm sure you've heard that one before. So it's just, but like I said in the comments as well, public transport in many cities outside of London is just, it just doesn't work properly. So getting people out of their cars is, that's not what you want to talk about. But I just wanted to say that in my city, there's tons of different schemes that are on, and they've all got very varying levels of success and support.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I guess that also sort of raises the questions about how, I mean, the cities you looked at have very different sizes, but they are still quite prominent cities, and they're quite sort of, they have a large population that is probably very inclined to these experiments or happy to have these experiments, at least in the parts that you are, or maybe I'm over. But if you think about Hackney, and if you think about Amsterdam and Ghent, and I don't know Munich that well, actually, that might be more conservative. But I was just wondering what your research might say about these types of practices in smaller cities.
Well, I think it's a really good point what Claire made about, you have to give people other options if you want to do something like this. Also to kind of soften the blow. But yeah, if you have really great public transport right around the corner, and they're going to close your street off to car traffic, then you're probably going to have a lot less people who are upset about it. But in smaller towns, I live in a smaller town called Amersfoort, which is about 45 minutes away from Amsterdam. And they did a street experiment here. It was only 2 days long. So you can ask yourself how impactful that is. But and it also rained the entire time on the second day, so no one was using it. But the first day, it was quite interesting to see how people responded to it, and I helped them out the city by doing some surveys and asking people on the street what they thought about it. And I would say here it's quite it's really 50-50. Like half of the people are very leftish, and they are all for sustainability and kind of changing these things, and they want the whole road to become a park. That was the whole idea. And then the other half is really asking, like, okay, but how on earth are we supposed to get around, because there are no other great options. So it was really quite split. But in any case, I think, at least from my perspective, I thought it was admirable that a city like this, a smaller town who's not Amsterdam, wanted to do something like this and actually try it, at least in their own way. So, yeah.
There was almost civil unrest in Amsterdam last year when they tried to mess with a few roads. Jesus, there was pandemonium. Especially the taxi drivers who were furious about it. No, but I noticed there's a lot of you talk a lot about local authorities as being key drivers, but certainly in Britain, many of them are just going bankrupt these days. The bigger cities like Birmingham and Nottingham, they just haven't got any money anymore. So how are they going to cope with doing clever things? It's going to be quite low down their list, isn't it? If they've got hospitals and schools and all these other things to worry about. So, what happens if local authorities are going to just fade because of economics in the future? Because in many places, they just don't work anymore.
Well, that's a good point.
Maybe that's just a problem in the UK, but
I think you could argue that at least the street experiment in the long term, you will encourage people to take more active modes, and then
so more bottom up perhaps rather than top down in the hope. And also thinking about mega cities, all these 10 million plus cities, and how does a local authority work in those places? Is it even relevant? Because they just seem to grow and evolve without much central planning, many of them. I'm just being cynical, perhaps. Luca knows about these things, perhaps. Mega cities, how do they control themselves?
No, actually, I was going to bring in something a bit, almost the other way around, but related. Just added to these things that have been said, which I agree with. Indeed, it's a point: do people have alternatives or not? And in any way, communication is essential, both to show people they have alternatives, but also to understand that they don't. To go beyond assumptions you might have, even again, about specific groups or even individual situations that might explain a reaction. So I think that's came out. It's very interesting to read the paper on what it will be published, because there's a lot, even more the interviews that Katherine did, because there's a lot of things you have to learn along the way, even in a context where it seems that alternatives are there, etc. And the other thing I want to add, and it really shows, that article shows that very well, it's a continuing process, this learning in any context. And the other issue that is being raised, which is interesting, becoming more and more central in this type of research, is that a lot of these things, but anyway, concepts, both as planning concept, but also the focus of a lot of research, it's really on cities. And when you say cities, it's the metropolitan cores we are talking about, highly dense, diverse, whereas a lot, if not most people, live in what sometimes is called the peri-urban, the suburbs, small towns, rural. And in this area, there are issues there, but some of the same, some are different. But there's a really urgent need to develop, concepts and do research to this place. So luckily, there is a growing shift of focus. We are also involved in, Katherine will also be involved in a project, and we are in others, which are really shifting the focus to where outside of the core. Because I think the first thing is to go there and engage with these places, which I think we have done relatively little historically. When you talk about mega cities, also mega cities are incredibly diverse. They have these cores, but they have also, very different kind of environments.
Yeah.
So maybe what Claire is describing is also what some concepts who have, been generated in London get transplanted to Newcastle without enough thinking. And again, maybe in the center they work there as well, and even in London, what Katherine said already a little bit about it is fascinating. I mean, not fun, but fascinating, the different reaction that in different boroughs these things generated, and
there was outrage. There were questions in Parliament about it. Such was the outrage.
Yeah. And
but now, 2 or 3 months on, it's gone quiet. It's interesting. 2 or 3 months, everybody was shouting, and there's a lot less in the press, and certainly not in Parliament anymore about it. So actually, that went quiet fairly quickly in the scheme of things.
A lot of course, there are definitely also, emotional issues, identity issues, not feeling acknowledged, whatever anyway, that's a bigger discussion.
Yeah.
I was just going to, sorry, I came in so late.
Hey.
Hello.
Nice to see you. I just wanted to respond to the fact that, cities don't have a lot of money to do any of these or much of this. I think that at the level of the experimentation, where it's really temporary kind of work, I live in a small city, Cincinnati, 300,000 people. But the majority of experimentation funding is coming from neighborhoods themselves. We did some modification to our main street in the neighborhood that I live in, which is also near the university. So the material was provided by the different businesses that have a little council here, and even residents contribute, $20 or whatever to that fund every year. It's not anything much at all. 2 students from the university from my class helped build the stuff with other neighbors who knew how to do it and had tools and brought things there. And we paid students the hourly wage that the university pays them. So it was all actually done essentially out of neighborhood funding and neighborhood labor. The only thing that we asked the city was to give us, don't embroil us in the whole elaborate permitting process, and let this be for what changes we made. We asked for a month, and then we extended it for, I think, another 8-9 weeks. So yeah, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. There is no money, and they think this is frivolous stuff. And they want to talk about the more serious things, obviously. But I would say that most of the stuff that's going around in these, at least in these smaller cities, are neighborhood level initiatives. Yeah, and businesses have their own business associations. Neighborhoods have their own neighborhood councils. We call it a town meeting. It's a small neighborhood council. So it's and that's just not in this neighborhood. Other neighborhoods are doing the same. And power to the energy of the young. They are there to make the change happen. So it's great.
Yeah,
Right.
can I add to that, because I think at least in the empirical studies that I looked at, because you said Cincinnati, right? Because yeah, I'm from Kentucky, so that's like very close. But what I noticed, a lot of like the open streets initiatives in the US, it seemed like they were like local community initiatives, and all of the other examples that I've seen, which also cost a lot more money, were ones that were started by municipalities, or really like part of a bigger funding program. Or in any case, they really involved like local government in some big role. And in the US examples, they were always kind of these smaller, like grassroots almost, local bottom up, well, students doing it. They were really kind of a different type. So I wonder if that's why, because this example in Amsterdam, this summer they closed down a pretty big street in the center of Amsterdam. And the pilot, they called it a pilot. They didn't call it an experiment, but the pilot cost 2 million euros to close down the street for was 6 weeks, right, Luca? Not 8. Originally, you wanted it to be 8. It turned into 6. They had to compromise a little bit because 8 was too much, and that included like actually doing that. So all of the things that go along with closing down a street, the materials, hiring people, all these things, but also the evaluation and the monitoring around that pilot made it so that it costs that much money. So you can imagine the difference is quite extraordinary, actually.
Can I ask, because you mentioned the personal costs somewhere in your presentation, of people getting burnout who are leading these things. Do you notice that only in these types of projects, or is that also a sort of danger in those smaller projects? And related to that, which of the two models is best suited to bring about the change that you're looking for? So your last slide.
Yeah, it's a good question. The burnout cases that I heard about were mostly in Ghent. That was quite a big operation, but it also had different phases. So in the beginning, for instance, it was really the city said, we're doing this. The politicians were on board, multiple departments were on board, and the people that were in charge of that eventually ended up having a burnout, and someone else had to take over. But also later on in the project, when it became kind of a smaller initiative that only the social department took over, those people kind of changed their way of doing things. So every time they did an experiment in a street, they would have to go and talk to every single person that lived there. Those people had to be on board, and if anyone was against it, then they also just went and knocked on the person's door and asked them like, hey, why are you against this? Can we figure something out? Which you can imagine obviously takes a lot of time and a lot of just mental energy to have those types of discussions, but also quite admirable that they, people from the municipality go and just talk to people on the street, which doesn't happen very often. But yeah, that's obviously also very intensive, and yeah. And the amount of people that they had at the beginning of the project was way more than they did in later versions of it, just in terms of manpower, which is also obviously related to budgets. So in the beginning, quite a bit, and then
yeah.
But I think this point that Katherine raised is quite crucial. When you think of these as really experiments, exploring a change of the system, is almost inevitable you got to this big conflict. I was at discussing in Groningen in the Netherlands, but they're also trying to make this shift. And they said at one point, so they're really aware of this. Groningen has also a long history of trying to do this thing. They say, actually, when we think of investment, half of it is the material part of it, and half of it is communication. I mean, interaction with people. So really quantitative. So that's a lot of, and I think, which is also emotional work. I remember, Katherine, when we were in London discussing with people that were working in the low traffic neighborhood, and there was, you're like, some of you have been evoking, there have been moments of incredible tensions, and they were really also exposed personally, being attacked in social media, and so they really needed support from others to get through it. So it's this part that I think it's always often underestimated. It's not just, of course, if you are in a country, everybody wants it. It's just a residential street of like-minded people. This might be very small, but when it's something really in a different context, I see Vikas with the hand. I don't want to take.
Yeah, I had my hand up because what has been troubling me for a while is that with all this effort that the community puts in material, labor, and communication, and that's really important because it takes so much to talk to people, to get them on board, etc., etc. And then when the sort of it becomes part of the program for capital, it feels like this whole thing is, all the work that is being done is for nothing. I'm sorry I bring this up. This is what I'm looking at recently, and it's very depressing because what has happened in Cincinnati specifically, in one of these older neighborhoods, is that every idea that has been tried in many, many places, from parklets to closed down streets and art on the street and everything, they have very cleverly, and some of these are our students that are now in positions of power, they have very well, in a very good way, co-opted all of it to make the place extremely, extremely pedestrian oriented, which could have never happened 5-6 years ago. Every business would say, I cannot lose a parking spot because I will go out of business. Now everybody's on board. They have essentially created funding from the Development Corporation. It's a community development corporation in Over the Rhine, 3CDC, and the city, and they have used the best materials to create these seating spaces that have captured and provided restaurants with fantastic outdoor furniture. The planters are absolutely state of the art. There's nothing tacky about it. Beautifully powder coated material, very well standardized. They're using Ipe wood, which will never ever go bad. It weathers really well. And you're like, this is wonderful. Sidewalks have been extended permanently. Crosswalks which are raised, art on the streets that are closed. And you're like, wow, this doesn't feel like a parochial small city like Cincinnati at all. But then you think, what is it coming to? Ultimately, that is a absolutely fast track way of following the gentrification that is already happening, because they don't mind sort of people who are coming there don't mind paying $20 for parking elsewhere because they took out the meters. where you could park for $3 an hour. And so it's kind of this very odd reversal where on one side you feel that whole neighborhood is now so pedestrian friendly. It's wonderful. Visually, tactically, it is a delight. And yet it's just going to become more and more homogeneous, more monolithical. You know, it's like saying what was in Manhattan was later in Brooklyn is now in Queens. So you can go to Manhattan and enjoy the wonderful advertisements and the lighting and the planters and all of that, but you can't afford to buy and eat any food there anymore. So it's a little, that's the part that I'm really troubled with, where is the sweet spot between the two? You know, it's largely the Soho phenomena. Artists come, they take the risks, they do all of that, then they're out. And this is happening at this very tactical street level. And you know, I keep saying capital, you know, has found public space. They know there is money in it. And you know, the tide turns with Instagram and all of that. That's all you need. So I'll stop there.
No, that's wonderful.
What do you say?
We're 5:10, so I just wanted to make sure that Katherine can, if she wants, respond to this, or
yeah, it's good that you bring that up, because that's also something that I've read in a few studies, like especially on the living streets, the gentrification that comes as a result of doing something like this, because usually it's people that have the time to organize such a thing or be involved in such a thing differs from the people who don't, and then the reason why it happens in one neighborhood versus another, those kind of questions. And usually the people, at least in that case, that were involved, they were already part of the municipality, or they get their urban designer, architect friends to be involved, and then it's already very exclusive from the beginning. And then where you place it and the diffusion effects of doing something like that, it's a big question. I didn't focus on gentrification in my research specifically, but yeah, the kind of commercialization of public space, and also I know some examples of some experiments also in London that there was a parklet or something, but it was part of a cafe, and in order to sit there you had to at least buy something, you know, these kind of things that just kind of defeat the whole purpose of using it as public space, and freeing it from cars. It kind of, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot in a way. So yeah, but there's definitely it's definitely a dark side of street experiments that we haven't looked at yet, but really important to think about.
I think that's maybe a little bit of an ominous sort of ending to something that started quite positive.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
No, but it's a valid point, I think, and I think your
last
especially your last slide is very intriguing. So to take this also on board is. I think we should break up slowly but surely, but it's really lovely to have you all here, to see everyone who's also in Amsterdam a year and a half